All right, let's dive right into this historical cold case. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to look strictly at the physical evidence beneath our feet to uncover the true origins of ancient Jerusalem. For a very long time, our understanding of this region's history was totally dictated by grand texts and ancient stories. But what happens when we put those texts down and pick up a trowel? What does the dirt actually tell us? Well, we are going to explore the myth of the United Monarchy, look at the grueling early excavations, and see how modern archaeology completely rewrote our understanding of the 10th century BCE. So, did this massive empire of David and Solomon actually exist? For centuries, we've been told these captivating stories of a wealthy, sprawling united monarchy in the 10th century BCE. We picture an empire boasting monumental architecture, vast wealth, and intense centralized power. It's an image that's deeply ingrained in our cultural memory. But we really need to step back and ask a fundamental question. Does the archaeological record, the actual soil and stone, support this grand narrative? To find out, we have to look back at how the search for this empire even began.
Section 1. The Search for the Empire.
We're starting our journey back in the 19th century, which was a time when archaeology was honestly more of an adventurous treasure hunt. In 1867, a British officer named Captain Charles Warren led the very first major excavation into Jerusalem's ancient past. And it wasn't easy. The original city was completely leveled by the Romans in 70 CE, and Emperor Hadrian later built a Roman city right over the ruins. Because the ancient remains were buried beneath layers and layers of Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic debris, Warren had to dig these incredibly deep, literally perilous vertical shafts just to reach the foundational bedrock and trace the ancient walls. The sheer physical effort required by Warren's team was just unbelievable. They were hunting for monumental architecture, basically tunneling blind under debris in incredibly dangerous conditions. Funny enough, a lot of the tunnels they triumphantly claimed were man-made marvels of ancient engineering were later proven by geologists to be, well, just natural cracks in the rock. The core issue with these early digs was their methodology. These early explorers were essentially using ancient texts, like the writings of the first-century historian Josephus, as literal treasure maps. They lacked modern stratigraphic methods, meaning they didn't really know how to date soil layers accurately. They were simply digging to validate a pre-existing idea of a massive ancient capital. But sources like Josephus describe the city as it was in the first century. They severely lacked topographical accuracy for the earliest periods of the city's existence. Section 2. The 10th century Jerusalem shock. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon delivers a massive reality check. Using modern stratigraphy, which is the meticulous dating of soil layers based on pottery sherds, she carefully mapped out the 10th century layers. And what she found was that the maximum total size of the fortified Jebusite village during the supposed time of David was a mere 4.5 hectares. It was a staggering revelation that completely contradicted the expectations of a sprawling capital. To really put that number into perspective, think about this. The entire footprint of this so-called imperial capital of Jerusalem was just 4.5 hectares. Meanwhile, just one single royal palace in the ancient Syrian city of Mari, featuring over 300 rooms, took up 2.5 hectares all by itself. Jerusalem was barely double the size of one single palace from a true ancient superpower. When Kenyon actually stood up on the peak of the Ophel Hill and looked at those steep, narrow slopes, she realized the physical constraints of the site were absolute. It is a small, tightly constrained space. There is simply no physical room there for vast palaces, bureaucratic centers, and the massive harems described in the texts. It just couldn't support an imperial infrastructure. And the demographic studies of the region completely back this up. Researchers estimate that the total population of all of Palestine during this era was, at most, 100,000 people. A massive, unified state requires a massive population to provide forced labor, soldiers, any solid tax base. A population of 100,000 spread across the entire region is nowhere near enough to sustain the grand empire described in the narratives. This harsh reality is perfectly summarized by leading Israeli archaeologist Amichai Mazar. He points out that extensive digging along the central hills revealed no 10th century additions to the city walls, no grand palaces built with imported Phoenician cedar, and almost no material wealth whatsoever. The artifacts simply aren't there. Jerusalem in the 10th century was just a modest, poor rural village. Which brings us to Section 3, the mystery of the missing space. You see, realizing Jerusalem was far too small to be the center of a great state, archaeologists decided to expand their search.
If the empire's grand footprint wasn't in the capital, surely they'd find its monumental architecture in the regional administrative centers, right? So they turned their attention to the north and the plains, specifically to these three cities, Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer. According to ancient texts, these three cities were supposedly heavily fortified administrative hubs built by King Solomon using forced labor and vast wealth.
At first, it seems like they'd hit the jackpot. Massive tripartite buildings discovered at Megiddo were famously heralded as Solomon's stables. It was a major sensation. But actually, scratch that. As dating techniques improved into the late 20th century, modern archaeology proved them completely wrong. Those structures actually belonged to an entirely different, much later era. Archaeologist David Ushishkin pointed out the stark truth of the matter. When scientists rigorously examined the soil across all these supposed royal cities, the 10th century layer was virtually silent. There were no monumental structures, no administrative buildings, and even a total lack of the everyday pottery sherds that would indicate a thriving, centralized 10th century state. So we're consistently seeing a completely new picture of the past. Whenever we search for imperial expansion in the 10th century, the hard scientific evidence completely contradicts the textual claims. The evidence scales everything down. We are left looking at a stark, rural landscape defined by small villages, not a unified, centralized state.
Section 4. The collapse of the monarchy myth. This overwhelming lack of evidence literally forced a shift in the entire field. As prominent archaeologist William Deaver puts it, the modern consensus is clear. Top archaeologists today recognize that the stories of a magnificent, unified empire stretching across the region were created much later. They were projected backward in time to establish a glorious, unified past that simply never physically existed in the dirt.
So what is the actual reality? Well, the scientific timeline showing a much more organic, natural progression. Israel to the north and Judah to the south were always two completely separate entities. Both grew naturally from local Canaanite populations. And true centralized state formation, the building of palaces, complex administrations, and massive walls, didn't actually occur until centuries later, in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. As archaeologist Israel Finkelstein noted, that grand romantic image of Jerusalem we often picture, it's basically a composite. It's an image fueled by centuries of later visions, layered on by pilgrims, crusaders, and storytellers. These legendary tales completely overwrote the reality of the small, impoverished 4.5-hectare Jebusite village it truly was back in the 10th century. Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought for this explainer. When we strip away the stories and look only at the stones, the world looks very, very different. How does our entire understanding of history change when we write it based on the hard evidence we actually dig out of the ground, rather than the grand narratives we expect to find? It makes you wonder, how many other historical empires might just be a beautifully constructed myth, just waiting for archaeology to uncover the stark, simple truth? Think about that, and thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the real history of ancient Jerusalem.